Hello and welcome to the Reviews Brothers. The Xbox 360 used to be my go-to console, of that generation at least, and it was home to some awesome games, many of which were first-person shooters, which just so happens to be one of my favourite genres. Of course, there were games like Halo and Call of Duty, but believe it or not, I was never really a massive fan of either of those franchises. I thought they were fine, but nowhere near as good as the hype that people gave them. This meant that I'd always keep an eye out for other first-person shooters that didn't always get talked about, and that's what we're looking at here, some FPS games for the Xbox 360 that don't always get talked about. I was going to include Prey and Bulletstorm here, but I feel that they do get talked about a lot nowadays, so I left them out. Anyway, how about I shut up, you press that subscribe button, and we find out if there's a reason that these games are largely ignored. First up is Blacksite. The story here is that you are, of course, a soldier, and you start the game investigating some of those bloody Middle Eastern terrorists. Will they ever learn? After a few missions of taking down their groups and bases, things start to get a little bit strange as you find weapons and even enemy units that don't look quite right. Soon you discover that they've been working with an alien race in a mission to conquer the planet. So you and your team, as well as the rest of the army of course, have to infiltrate further and take them down from the inside. It's your standard alien terrorist crossover story, and it's fine, though it does take itself a little bit too seriously. The game is broken into some pretty linear levels, which are just you moving from one gunfight and set piece to the next, but I actually don't mind this type of game design as it keeps the pace going nicely, and actually some of the levels are pretty cool. You spend most of your time on foot, where you use a mixture of your standard military shooter weapons, but later in the game you also have access to more powerful alien weaponry. You can carry a few weapons at a time, which is nice, and you'll want a mixture of guns that are good up close and some that are better at range. Though, like most games like this, you'll tend to find your favourite 2 or 3 weapons and just stick to them. Some levels work as on-rail shooters where you're gunning down enemies from turrets, and in some you even have to control choppers or tanks. The variety isn't bad at all. And most importantly, the combat isn't bad either. The guns themselves all feel solid and pack a punch. The controls are decent and responsive, and aiming is kind of easy. The game has a more arcade feel to it, and this isn't a game that you'll need to be constantly using your iron sights for, which is kind of refreshing. You can always get away with running in all guns blazing. The enemy designs are all fun too. Obviously you've got your generic human terrorists that are just copy and paste from any other game like this, but then the aliens start joining the fight and you get some really cool battles with humans on the front line. Then all of a sudden their alien mates that are often huge insect looking things will appear and start kicking your ass. Then there's massive alien bosses that take up most of the screen. It's pretty cool fighting these and finding their weak spots. As you play, you can also give your squad mates commands, getting them to attack enemies, take up new positions, or open doors while you give them cover. What's good is that this is all done with just one button, and your teammates actually respond well, and I never found that they wouldn't do what I needed them to. Graphically, the game is fine. I'd say it's below average for the time, but the weapon models and scenery look alright, as do the animations. There's some strange lighting effects and reflections here and there, but overall it's not offensive and it looks decent enough. There's not much in the way of music here, and the sounds are probably what you'd expect, though I did find that I got sick of the tough guy script here, and mostly wanted my team just to shut up. They really went overboard with their gruff, tough soldiers, and it really sounds like the kind of thing a teenager would write or say when they're trying to be tough, but hey, maybe that's how American soldiers speak. Overall though, I enjoyed playing through this one. It is pretty generic, but it's a solid title that I would say is worth a look if you're looking for a mindless shooter that won't take up too much of your time. Bodycount is one that I never hear anyone talking about, which is actually kind of surprising because I think it's great. The story here is an overly complicated and totally skippable one, but it's the usual thing of you being a special forces bloke who is also a one-man army that is sent to missions across the world fighting rebel factions, only to discover that they have some strange, incredibly high-tech bases filled with weapons and, well, tech. I guess it's kind of the same story as the Blacksite game, but without the aliens. You're dropped into a load of levels, each with their own objectives, and this is another game that really plays more like an arcade or old school style shooter, as it's all about fast paced action, loads of massive weapons and tons of enemies and explosions. Your objectives range from setting or sometimes defusing bombs, killing gang leaders, destroying things, hacking terminals and that sort of thing. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it manages to be a lot of fun and really doesn't take itself seriously. Usually with things like hacking or defusing a bomb, how it works is that when you're in range of it, a timer will start. Meanwhile, enemies will start pouring in. Then you've got limited space where you can move around and just have to survive until the time runs out. I actually kind of like this, and it's better than some of the lame disarming minigames that you get in other games. You do also have a marker on the screen pointing to where you need to go, so you never get too lost and won't waste much time running around not knowing where to go. The actual combat, which is of course the main thing here, is great. The weapons are all fun to use, but aren't anything too exotic. It's all pistols, shotguns and machine guns. Of course you've got grenades to throw with the shoulder buttons as well, and you even get proximity mines, so you can set traps that are very handy for the bosses. There's always a ton of enemies coming for you, and gunning them down is incredibly satisfying, no matter what weapon you're using. Enemies drop health and ammo pickups, but for new weapons you'll need to find weapon crates that let you change your loadout. You won't need to aim down the sights here too much either, but if you do, then you're actually fixed in one place. But when doing this you can dodge left, right, up and down. You can't take a ton of hits, so your best strategy is usually to find some cover, hold down the L button, then peek out and take down some fools. But you got to be quick, as one of the big things with the game are the destructible environments, and they are very destructible. Almost all cover and walls and scenery can be destroyed, and it looks amazing. Things will be blowing up all over the place, and if you spot an enemy running behind cover, just blow it to bits and take his head off. Also, if you need a shortcut, just get your shotgun out and blow a hole in the wall to go through. This is so much fun, and it really opens up the levels in a way that most games don't. And the enemies themselves, although there's only a handful of different types, are big and chunky and explode in a very satisfying way. Graphically, this game is fantastic. I did end up having to change the brightness on some levels though, as it was a bit dark, but they all look really good, and there's so much to blow up with the explosions, particles and enemies and guns all over the place, and I didn't really see any slowdown. It can get a little confusing with so much going on all the times, and I did have to retreat and take a breath a few times to try and figure out where the hell I was being attacked from. Usually the answer to that was just about everywhere. There are quite a few levels here too, and while there are a few that gets reused, which is a bit of a shame, the variety is decent enough. They're all basically large arenas that you can tell were likely designed for multiplayer games, but they work well enough in single player. And after every few levels, you even get an ability which you can activate with the different directions on the D-pad. You get things like health bonuses, explosive rounds and all that kind of thing, which come in very handy in the middle of a gunfight, but they can be tricky to use as you need to take your hand off the stick to use them, and then you've got to wait for them to recharge after a few seconds. Overall though, I really like this game. It's got fast-paced, punchy action with some really cool over-the-top gunfights. It's definitely a challenge and one to try if you like things that go boom. Homefront is a really interesting game, with the story here being that South Korea and North Korea are no longer enemies and are united as one happy family, and as a family they decide to invade America, and apparently they do quite a good job of it, as now there's a full-blown war and you're stuck in the middle of it. So yeah, you set out on a number of skirmishes where you'll be taking down enemy soldiers in an ever-exciting number of battles in the middle of towns, gas stations, enemy bases and of course the White House. You'll be kitted out with your usual array of shooty bang-bangs, you get pistols, machine guns, etc. But as the game is set in the near future, they all feel a little different to some games, and they're all very good to use. This is a game where you will want to aim down the sights of your gun though, and not shoot from the hip if you want a chance of hitting things. But the controls are super smooth and responsive, and killing people has never been easier. Now, as it is the near future, you also have a few new cool tricks up your sleeve. Most notably is the Goliath, which is a virtually indestructible remote control tank thing that you can use in most levels to target enemies and structures and blow them to bits. This is really good fun and doesn't get overused. The actual levels themselves are mostly made up of set pieces, and the game does play a lot like your Call of Duty games. You'll have some where you're in the middle of a massive gunfight where you have to take cover in some random house while tanks bombard the streets, then you'll be defending a corner shop hiding behind some beef jerky, and then you're playing stealthily in an overgrown park, hiding in the grass with a sniper rifle waiting for the best time to take out the bad guys. The game also has levels which are purely for story and drama purposes, where you're just wandering around your bases looking at all the sad people that have lost everything. It does do a good job of having a somber tone at times and can make you sympathise and become an absolute racist. That last part isn't true, by the way. One of the standout things for the game are the graphics, which are just incredible. I really think this is one of the best looking games on the system. The whole world just looks fantastic and very realistic, especially for the time. Also, all the weapon models are incredibly detailed and the animation here is consistently smooth and just great to watch. Couple that with excellent controls and the story that is very engaging, and you've got a really good package. I do also have the sequel that came out for the PS4 and the Xbox, but I haven't played that yet. However, if it's as good as this one, then I'll be in for a treat. I'm really surprised that this game doesn't get talked about all that much. I actually prefer it to Call of Duty, though keep in mind I'm a single player gamer and don't care about online, so that's probably where Call of Duty wins out. But if you're a fan of single player FPS games, then I'd say this is a must have for the Xbox 360. It doesn't really do anything new that we haven't seen before, but the look and feel of the game alone make it well worth playing. Here is Hour of Victory, one of many World War II shooters that came out around this time. This one does try to mix things up by letting you choose from 3 characters, each of which have their own weapons and even items and abilities that grant them access to different areas and paths throughout each level, which is a pretty cool idea. It's just a shame about the rest of the game. The 3 characters are Ross, the commando, who's your run in and shoot people kind of guy, Bull, the ranger, who's got a sniper rifle, so is best for taking people out from a distance and being kind of stealthy, and then there's Taggart, who's a mix of both. Each has their own items, like a rope that can be used to climb to certain areas, or a set of pliers that can be used to cut fences to get access to new places. You'll soon find which character suits your playstyle, and this is a nice touch. It's just that playing the game is just a mess. It's a shame, as the levels are actually kind of interesting. You'll be storming enemy ramparts, taking down bomber planes with gun turrets, avoiding tanks, exploring castles, and of course sewer systems. All the while, Nazis are trying to shoot you in the face. So, what are the problems? Well, just about everything when you start playing. The controls here immediately feel slow and imprecise, and the hit detection just seems to be random, and I'd consistently get stuck on scenery. The game is a real test of patience. You can be aiming your sights right at someone, pull the trigger, but nothing happens, absolutely nothing. They just stand there looking at you, and even when you do hit an enemy, there's no indication that you've done so, with no blood or a marker, making it really hard to figure out if you're actually doing anything. It just feels kind of cheap and unfinished. The enemies are also pretty dumb, but still very deadly. They basically just either run at you or stay behind cover. They'll pop out every now and then and are very accurate, even on the lower difficulties. And don't get me started on the levels with the vehicles. There are some where you're taking down planes, but they appear at random and they're very hard to hit. Again, you also get no real indication that you're even damaging them. Then there's levels where you're fighting against tanks, and you better kiss your ass goodbye. No matter what character you're playing as, these are a pain in the ass. And of course there's escort missions with characters that do everything they can just to get in your way and be annoying as hell. Graphically, the game is kind of ugly too. The actual environments aren't too bad, but the characters all look very basic and have very stiff animation. It just takes any engagement out of the game. I did play this all the way through, but I really had to force myself to do it. Definitely not one I would recommend, not even to laugh at. Legendary is an interesting shooter with a very original premise. You've come across Pandora's box, and of course you open it. This causes hundreds of ancient monsters to be unleashed into the world, including griffins, werewolves and golems. Turns out there's a bunch of evil people also, called the Black Order, because of course they are. And these guys are all about this life and doing everything they can to make sure the end of the world happens and the monsters reign supreme. Now we can't be having that, and luckily, as the one that opened the box, you now have superpowers, meaning you're tougher than the average Toby and can use magic powers to heal yourself and even attack. So while the premise is cool, it's not exactly groundbreaking, but I do really love the idea of ancient monsters in modern times, and it's a shame this kind of thing isn't used more often. Pretty much all the levels that you see are exploring urban areas that have been overrun, and it's really cool to see citizens and cities being attacked by huge monsters. Some of them are Godzilla sized that take down skyscrapers, and it looks really good at the start of the game when you're unarmed and trying to escape through the streets. It's a really cool opening to the game. It's not that long before you have your usual array of weaponry, and for the most part this is good at taking down enemies. The shotgun in particular is really devastating up close, blowing werewolves away in just a few shots. But what's kind of cool is that you can't kill a lot of enemies just by shooting them. You've got to take off their heads or suck their life force. Thankfully, one of your weapons that you find early on is an axe, which you can use to chop some bonces off, after shooting enemies enough that they pass out for a few seconds. As mentioned, you do also have some special powers, and when enemies die they drop glowing mana stuff. You can absorb this to use your powers, which are to heal yourself, or you can let out a burst of energy that damages enemies and knocks them back to give you a bit of a breather. This is handy as you're often swamped by monsters. I have to say though, I was a little disappointed with the number of different enemy types. There's only a handful of enemies, and the game sets itself up for the potential of having dozens of well-known monsters and folklore-inspired beasts, but for the most of the game you're just fighting werewolves, griffins and evil fairies. But the combat is pretty good, it's not the best, and aiming can be a little sluggish, but it's definitely playable. Graphically, the game does look good, and again, the human characters aren't the best, but the monsters all look really cool, and the scenery is often fantastic with some excellent lighting in places. It's a pretty easy game too, the levels are very linear and it's not that long, but there are some nice touches like needing to use your axe to cut wires that create new paths and cause buildings to collapse, but it's never anything particularly groundbreaking. The characters themselves are about as generic as it gets as well, but it's really the monster action that you'll be here for, and I think that's pretty fun. I know this game got pretty bad reviews, which I don't really agree with. It's definitely not the best game on the system or anything, but it is a solid shooter that's very different to most of the other ones out there, and I'd say it is worth a look these days. If it's unbelievably generic first-person shooters that you're after, well, it doesn't get more unbelievably generic than Secret Service, surprisingly from Activision. You are indeed a Secret Service agent who is one of the president's top bodyguards, and you'll never believe it, but terrorists have decided they want to kidnap the president, so it's up to you to shoot them in the face. Of course, along the way you find all sorts of crazy conspiracies, and you never really know who you can trust, and at one point you even become the man on the run as they think you had something to do with it. It's all just so exciting. Now, honestly, with this game, if you were to close your eyes and imagine just how that looks like in a video game, I'm pretty sure you would immediately picture this game perfectly. You make your way from the White House to other American landmarks and exciting environments like an airport and even a warehouse, all of which have been overrun by the equivalent of those people Trump got to storm the White House that time. You start with your standard issue pistol, but soon get a range of shotguns, automatic weapons, and even a sniper rifle to help you take out those non-patriotic bastards. And you know what? The game actually handles surprisingly well. The controls are solid and responsive, and it's actually quite fun shooting people here. You can take cover behind objects and peek out left and right to take some precise shots before lobbing a grenade and running in guns blading. But you do have to be careful as the enemies are incredibly accurate, and you can't take too many bullets to the ball bag before you snuff it. Thankfully there are a few checkpoints, but something that was a pain in the ass is that the objective indicator at the top of the screen was quite often useless, and it did help me get lost in quite a few levels more than it helped me. Being real world-ish locations, most of them are kinda samey, and I couldn't tell a lot of the corridors apart, thinking I was somewhere new when I really wasn't. But really, none of the levels are big enough to cause that much of a problem. You don't really get much in the way to do, other than kill everyone until you get to where you're going. But occasionally you'll find bombs to defuse. These have a mini-game where you have to match up wires to the resistor things. These are fine, but they're kind of poorly executed and explained, and you don't get much time to do them, so they became quite frustrating, with me dreading them when I had to do one. Also, in some levels you can't use lethal force, so you need to rely on your taser gun. This is kind of fun and adds some strategy as the enemies will eventually get back up and hunt you down, so you've got to move quickly. But it's hard to hit enemies with it, and the range isn't particularly good. Meanwhile, they're blowing you to bits with AK-47s. Graphically, the game is fine. It basically does the bare minimum in just about every area, but doesn't look terrible. And really, that's how I'd probably sum up this game. It does the bare minimum in just about every area. It's not terrible, but at the same time it is just kind of pointless, and I don't really know who this is aimed at. It's a single player only game, so it's not like they were even hoping for some cool Saving the President multiplayer maps. But hey, it exists and I bought it, but there's really no reason for anybody else to. Syndicate is an awesome first-person shooter set in the future where cybernetic implants and espionage are all the rage. Based on the original strategy game for the DOS and Amiga games, the story continues with you being a Syndicate operative, the specially trained sort of chap that likes to do murders and stuff, but for a company, so it's alright. Shockingly, this company turns out to be up to no good, but because you're such a good guy, you decide to take them down along with a few other do-gooders. Now, the problem I'm having at the moment describing these games is that basically they all kind of sound the same, and let's face it, most of them are kind of similar, but with a few unique things thrown in here and there. And what sets this one apart from the others we've seen is the setting. You have some pretty large missions here, and you'll be going all over the world, mostly to futuristic looking places that are incredibly shiny, and then you'll need to complete objectives like sneaking around and stealing information to killing certain people and everything in between. But the way you do this is just so cool. As a Syndicate person, as well as your usual array of weapons, because this is the future, everyone has implants in their faces that you can hack into to make them do all sorts of things, and it's great. You can make people's brain chips spark, which will stun them for a while, or you can make them think that you're their friend so they'll fight with you, or you can even make them go crazy and kill themselves so you don't even need to waste a bullet on them. Of course, doing these things takes energy which recharges over time, so you can use some of these things more than others. So it's not like you can go into a room and just make everyone kill themselves, although that would be pretty epic. Instead, you need to be tactical and use the lower powered powers when there's loads of enemies, so you can stun them all and shoot them. Unless you're confident enough to take out the strongest guy by suicide, then hope you've got enough ammo to deal with the rest of the team. It's a really cool mechanic that's used perfectly throughout the game, and is often required for puzzles, like if you need to access a certain area, you could make friends with one of the guards and he'll think you're your mate, so he unlocks certain doors for you. You also have the ability to turn your dart overlay on, which is basically an X-ray vision, where you'll see items, enemies and objectives all highlighted, even through some walls. This makes you a lot more accurate too, but again, you can't just use it as much as you like, and you'll need it to recharge. Of course, using guns here feels great, and the controls overall are just spot on. This is one of those games where you can see your whole body when you look down, so the physics are a bit more realistic, but it still plays incredibly well and is always loads of fun. And the graphics are incredible, and some of the best on the system, which I know I've already said today. The character models, levels, lighting and particle effects are so damn good that you can really see the inspiration from things like Blade Runner. I couldn't get over how good this game looked, and it really is one of those games that look like it could be an early PS4 game, not an Xbox 360 one. While the story here is a little pretentious and up its own arse, the game is a total hidden gem that you would be forgiven for thinking it's a generic title, but give it a go and you won't be disappointed. It's awesome from start to finish, especially when you're ripping other people's chips out of their eyeballs so you can stick it in your own head. What a cool thing to do. Timeshift is an early game for the system and was the one that I got in my early days of the 360, and it's also a game that I'm happy to say holds up pretty well to this day. Yeah, the story is about as generic as it gets, with a dystopian future where time tech has been invented and evil people invaded, and they're trying to get their hands on it, so you've got to go wipe them all out. Being an early game for the system, this doesn't necessarily have the quality of life improvements we saw in later games in terms of controls and overall design, but it's still a solid experience that has some really cool moments in it. It's your usual settings of big cities for the most part here, where you'll be exploring dilapidated buildings, construction sites and yes, even sewers, looking for bad guys to murder in cold blood. But you also get a fair few levels out in the country, which is nice, and they even give you a few vehicles to ride, which can be tough to control, but overall are a good addition to the game. Enemies are your standard future soldier fare, armed to the teeth with various laser and bullet weapons. In fact, the weapons here are definitely a plus point to the game. Yeah, they boil down to being the usual stuff, but as it's the future, they all look cool and always have a decent second function, like rockets for the machine gun or burst fire for pistols. This is one of those games where each weapon has a purpose too, and you'll often be switching guns in the middle of a gunfight to suit the situation, and I really like this. You get a number of objectives in the levels too, but these never really require you to do anything other than get somewhere and interact with something, and then the game will do the rest for you. But the main thing here is the fact that your suit has time powers, and these are all used throughout the game. You can slow down time, which is your main go-to power, and it lets you run past enemies, dodge their bullets and shoot them a ton before they even get a chance to blink. But you can also pause time completely, but this only lasts a few seconds. However, it can be valuable in a gunfight as you can sneak to a better vantage point without being seen, Or you can do a cool thing where you freeze time and then unload a clip into an enemy, and then when time unfreezes, they're hit with 50 bullets to the face and go flying. Also, when you freeze time, you can run up to enemies and steal their weapons. Then, when time comes back to normal, they're very confused about where their gun's gone, and then you shoot them in the face while laughing like a maniac. Finally, you can also rewind time a few seconds. This isn't all that useful, and isn't very handy in battles, surprisingly. But the powers are mainly used for solving puzzles, and as I'm sure you can guess, rewinding time comes in very handy for repairing bridges that have been blown up, or resurrecting mates that have just been gunned down. You'll also need to slow down time to stop being able to get past electric currents, or even run over water. The game does do a good job of using these, but it's never overkill, and actually, when you're used to it, using your time powers in combat while also navigating the environment becomes second nature and works really well. Graphically, I think the game is excellent considering that it's a very early game. It still looks like a really good one, and it's down to the excellent design. It's got a sort of cartoony look to the characters and weapons. In fact, it actually reminds me of Time Splitters from the previous generation, and it works well, and it means that it toes the line between serious and cartoony. It's always these sorts of art styles that hold up best if you ask me. The controls here are solid, very smooth and responsive, but there are a few things that can be a pain, like having to click in the left stick to aim, which just doesn't feel natural these days, but it won't take you long to get used to it. Overall, this is still a really good game that I enjoy. I'd recommend getting it, as I'm sure it'll be cheap these days. In fact, that probably applies to every game you've seen here, but this one is kind of unique and worth a look. And finally for today, here is Turning Point: Fall of Liberty. This is another game based on an alternate history, but this time it's us here in England that have failed to fight off the Nazis. Like that would ever happen. This has caused all sorts of trouble across the world, but it's alright, because there's plans to sort out the Jerrys and give them a good spanking once and for all. So yeah, it's the usual guff of you being in a resistance, and you've got to fight your way through New York, Washington and eventually London as the heroically named Carter, so you can save the world. This is one of those games that really does try to have some cool ideas in it, and it does its best to mix things up, but sadly fails in pretty much every area. The levels are all pretty large and often see you exploring ruined buildings or streets, fighting off Nazis with World War II-esque weapons, which are unreliable at best, and in this game are really quite useless. You rarely have anything other than kill everything and get from A to B to do, but usually getting from A to B will involve some basic platforming and climbing, which you'll do all over the place. And when you do, the camera switches to a third-person view, which is kind of odd, as there's absolutely no reason for it to do this, and all it does is serve to slow down the gameplay, and you often get shot by enemies who are off-screen thanks to the changed camera angle. And this is a big problem, because the game is incredibly tight with its checkpoints, and if you die, chances are you're going to have to go back to the very start of the level, which is incredibly annoying for many reasons. Mainly because you can lose half an hour or more's worth of progress, but also this is one of those games where every level starts off really slowly while they try to build some tension. So it might be that you're hiding from enemies and there's a 5-minute unskippable bit of dialogue. Then, before you know it, a tank bursts in and kills you. But you had no way of knowing that was going to happen, so it's back to the start of the level, and you've got to watch all that boring dialogue again. You avoid the tank this time, but then you discover enemies are dropping in from the roof behind you, and they shoot you in the back, so it's back to the start of the level. Now, I know this thing does happen in a few games, but most of them will at least have the courtesy of having a checkpoint after the long bits of dialogue. It's all in game, so they can't really make it skippable though, I suppose. But it is bloody tedious, and it actually made me shut the game off when I was about 20 minutes into a level, only to die and have to go back to the start of the level about another 4 or 5 times. It doesn't help that a lot of the gunfights go on for ages, and it's often just you against dozens of enemies, and you're not particularly bulletproof, and when it comes to the platforming sections, it's easy to fall to your death. It just makes the whole thing quite frustrating. And this is another game where the weapons often don't feel like they're doing anything at all. You could swear that you've shot a bloke in the face, but it doesn't seem to have done anything, whereas other times you can shoot a bloke from a mile away with a potato and his head will fall off. There's just no consistency, and it's very annoying. The graphics here are fine. I wouldn't say they're bad, but they're pretty bland, and I feel like a lot of stock assets have been used here. The actual levels aren't bad though, and in fact some of them have moments that are genuinely impressive, like when you're fighting on a bridge near the end of the game, or at the start when enemies are parachuting in while you're at work on a construction site. Like I said earlier, the game really does try to have some cool stuff in there, it's just not executed very well at all. I bought this game for £2, and yeah, I'd say it was worth that, but it's not a good game. Not really one that anyone else needs to bother with. So there you go, a selection of Xbox 360 first-person shooters that don't always get talked about. I've got a load more of these games, so might do a follow-up in the future. In the meantime, be sure to let me know your favourites and what other ones I could include if I do a follow-up. Hell, you can even give me some suggestions on other video topics that you'd like to see. Now, all that's left for me to say is thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.